Stephan Wiedner is a psychological safety expert whose career has focused on developing sustainable high-performance leaders, teams, and organizations. His passion for unleashing the collective potential of people has led him to co-found Noomi.com, the web's largest network of independent life coaches, Skillsetter.com, the deliberate practice platform for interpersonal skills, and Zarango.com, the psychological safety training experts. So we talked to Stephan about psychological safety, of course, the secret sauce for great teams and common mistakes that people make while thinking about teams. We also spoke about how things have changed since the pandemic hit, his tips for managers, and how to measure psychological safety. This was a wonderful, thought-provoking conversation that got me to apply some ideas immediately, and I'm sure you'll love it. If you're curious about what makes teams successful, you'll find this useful. This is the CTQ Smartcast, where we have conversations about upleveling, deliberate practice, and getting future relevant. Hi, welcome Stephan. Welcome to the CTQ Smartcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to participate.
Yeah. So let's get started with probably the most basic question to start this Smartcast with. So how do you really explain psychological safety to entrepreneurs and business owners?
Well, I like to explain it with a situation that most people can relate to. So often start with a classroom setting. So we probably have all experienced being in a classroom, unless you've been homeschooled or had some sort of other educational background. And in that classroom, we could probably all relate to moments where a question is being asked and you're not quite sure if you put your hand up to answer it, or maybe you're really eager. But let's imagine that you're a little hesitant to put your hand up to answer a question that's posed in the classroom. Why might you be hesitant? I'm asking you that now. Why might you be hesitant, for example, in a classroom to raise your hand?
Yeah, because you're not sure, what the reaction is going to be. Somebody might just rebuke you. Somebody might put you down. You may look like a fool out there,
Exactly. So and that's very common. So most people are going to be concerned about what they say will be perceived by the other people around them. And maybe there's some sort of repercussion. Maybe someone's going to laugh at you. Maybe someone's going to dispute what you just said because what you're saying is maybe unconventional, etc. So that is psychological safety. What is it? It's that ability within a group setting to speak up, say what's on your mind, express concerns. And it's happening all the time where we are refraining from or hesitating to speak up because of those interpersonal concerns that we have. And that's what psychological safety is. And in a business setting, sure, I just described it in a classroom setting. In a business setting, it's the same thing. When you're within a team, you're going to be concerned about what others are going to be thinking about you, especially if there's a difference in hierarchy, right? If there's someone that's higher up in the organization, someone who's superior to you, maybe up a level, maybe up 2 levels, you're going to be particularly concerned about what you say. And the need for and we know psychological safety is it's a quality or a characteristic of high performance teams, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. Is that helpful? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. A subpart to that question, there would always be levels of psychological safety as well, right? Even in a great high performing culture, you might have your immediate team where you feel the safest, but as you keep growing, as you keep going in the organization, right up to say the last level in the organization, that safety is probably going to not be the same as you feel with your immediate team. So is that something that is common? Am I interpreting it wrong? Is just your comment on that?
Absolutely. Well, a lot of people will think about psychological safety akin to culture. So maybe intuitively we understand that there's some sort of connection there. And I see culture as being, for example, a weather system. So imagine an entire country, you have a weather system, but then you have pockets of hot and cold in various different cities or regions. Same thing within an organization. If your culture overall is positive and encouraging, etc., You might have pockets where psychological safety is higher and lower, depending on the individuals in that in those divisions or in those teams. It's also dependent on other factors. It's not just who's in those teams, but perhaps what those teams are responsible for. So, for example, if you're in the legal team, your tolerance for risk might be a lot lower, right? So suggesting new ideas might not be tolerated nearly as much as, say, a team that's responsible for innovative new technology.
Right. Yeah. And the first time I actually heard of the concept of psychological safety was in the context of Project Aristotle. That Google had done, where they studied bunch of different kinds of teams, and the one thing that they found common among all the high performing teams was psychological safety. And that's what actually led me to go down that rabbit hole, trying to figure out what psychological safety is. Probably I'd felt it, but didn't have a term for it then. What has your experience been with, the findings of Project Aristotle, and, what's your take on that?
Well, Project Aristotle is a wonderful support structure, if you will, for our work, because when we go into organizations, often the first thing we need to do is explain what psychological safety is and why it's meaningful or important. And the fact that we can draw upon the research that Google did, as you already mentioned, they looked at 180 teams. They looked at 250 factors that might correlate with high performance within those teams, and nothing correlated. Then they finally came across the concept of psychological safety, and lo and behold, it was the number one factor that correlated with high performance teams, as you already mentioned. So that data-driven, evidence-based approach that they took to producing their findings adds a lot of weight. And so when we bring it into organizations, it catches a lot of people's attention. Sometimes psychological safety can be, if you don't know what that term means, it might seem kind of airy-fairy. It might seem a little bit unconcrete, if that's a word, not very substantial. It might seem kind of soft for a business crowd. And so when we can bring in that data and that evidence, it just gives it a whole lot more credence.
Right. And has this been something of a new thing that people have noticed? Did teams back in 1950s also have psychological safety? How has the whole, field sort of evolved over the years?
Well, I think that years ago, say 50 years ago, if we can go back in time, psychological safety was always present, right? It's a psychological phenomenon. So there were always teams with high psychological safety and some without. And I've been often scratching my head saying, okay, why is this now really bubbling to the surface? Because it's becoming a lot more commonplace. A lot more people are discussing it and talking about it. And I believe the reason is because our world is becoming so much more complex. The challenges that we're facing are global, they're ambiguous, and so that's forcing teams to have to cooperate. Because what does psychological safety ultimately facilitate? It ultimately facilitates good decision making. Because every day we're making lots of small decisions and some big decisions, and those decisions rely on objective data. And the more people you have in a room, the more opinions that you have, and those opinions need to be shared so that the best decisions can be made. And once upon a time, it wasn't nearly as necessary. I'd say 50, 60 years ago, it wasn't nearly as necessary to have interdisciplinary teams coming together to solve complex problems. Now that is commonplace, right? Look at the pandemic and now all the logistics issues that have fallen out of that. Technology accelerating. I mean, the workplace is changing so rapidly that psychological safety is absolutely necessary to just even keep up.
Right. Yeah. And then that brings me to the next question. We spoke about how things have evolved over the last 2 years. With the pandemic, sort of has affected teamwork in all kinds of teams, right? So what should leaders keep in mind when they think about, psychological safety?
Well, that takes me back to the beginning of COVID and the global pandemic. And I reached out to one of my colleagues that we were doing some work with, and he's in the learning and development space, right? So it's sort of that's his role within his organization. They have maybe 1,500 people, so not a huge global organization, but big enough. And what he did is he went out and solicited input from a bunch of different managers within his organization. And he found that it was very bimodal, because the question, or one of the questions he was asking them is, how is your team doing? So this is 30 days or 60 days into this global pandemic, right? Where there was tons of uncertainty. I think there's still even some uncertainty today. However, back then, if we can all go back in time, remember how much uncertainty there was. And so what he discovered is that there were two pools of managers. There was one set of managers that when he asked them that question, how's your team doing? They said, I don't know. And then the other half of the managers were saying, oh, they're so overwhelmed and concerned and stressed out, and I'm stressed out, and I don't know what to say to them because I don't know what life's going to look like. And they're asking if we're going to work remotely or if we're going to come back to the office, and I don't know. So you can see how there was two different camps there. And the one camp that didn't know, they were clearly not well connected to their team. Their team was guaranteed feeling that anxiety and that stress, but that team did not feel safe. They didn't have the psychological safety to say it, to express their concerns, to ask for input from their leader. Instead, they just bottled up, they kept it inside. So as managers and as leaders in today's world, I'd say the number one lesson is you need to stay connected with your people, especially if you're working remotely. And you need to be able to figure out how to connect with them more personally, one-on-one, or maybe within your team, you have informal conversations where people can just share their concerns. And it doesn't mean you have to solve all of their concerns all the time. You want to just be able to provide that arena for them to be able to voice their concerns so that you know that how they're doing, legitimately how they're doing. And if you ask them once and they just say, yeah, I'm good. Yeah, no problem. Maybe stay with it a little bit longer, right? Be a little more patient and ask them a few more poking and prodding questions without being disrespectful. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And, this resonates a lot with us because we do work in this space where we help create some of these platforms for teams to come together, know more about each other at a more human level, and not just the deliverable that the other person is sending across to me, but actually understanding who that person is. And we keep actually having these conversations with leaders, that it's not like you just say that this is a platform, come speak up, and people are going to line up and just vent out. It doesn't happen so easily. You have to actually work on that. So yes, completely resonates with me. We spoke about Project Aristotle earlier, and now we just spoke about teams. So that brings me to another question that I had. In your opinion, what is the secret sauce of building a successful team?
Well, I think I alluded to it a little bit there, right? Having the patience to ask the right questions. And so the secret sauce for us, in order to figure out what that is, we draw upon our experience in counseling, mental health, counseling and therapy. I don't know what you know or how familiar you are with that space, but we looked at it and it seems incongruous. Why would we look at counseling for a business setting? How are those two things relevant? Well, let's look a little closer about what counselors do. Counselors and therapists, they work with individuals one-on-one to support them in their career and their mental health and various other aspects of their lives, right? Relationships, etc. And so the power of the relationship is paramount there. So in order for a counselor or a therapist to help their client get better outcomes, they need to form a really strong relationship. And we see a parallel within teams. In teams, what are you trying to facilitate? you're still trying to facilitate good, positive outcomes that are in line with the organization's desires. And in order to achieve those outcomes, there's this interconnectedness that the members of the team have in order to solve problems together. And so the role of the leader or the manager is to facilitate those connections and those strong relationships in order to produce outcomes. And how do you do that? You do that through really skillful interpersonal skills. And we also know that in counseling, there are a set of interpersonal skills that are sometimes called facilitative interpersonal skills that they can be measured. And they, in the world of counseling, have proven to be predictive of client outcomes. So when a counselor is, maybe I'll explain it a slightly different way. If you look at all the different types of counselors out there, career counselors, some that focus on different methodologies, there's always good ones and bad ones, right? Within every sort of vertical. And so the researchers have asked, well, what's common among all the best? So if we look at all the top performing counselors, what's true among all of them? And what characterizes the best counselors is their degree of empathy and how well they can build a bond with their client. And if there's some sort of rupture within the client relationship, they can approach it in a skillful manner to repair it and make it strong again. And it's so sure, within school, you have to learn how to be a counselor. You have to learn what questions to ask, but there's also this, there's the how and the what. So you have to learn what to do, but then there's the how. It's similar in business, where you have to learn to do a one-on-one, and you have to learn to have various forms of meetings. And in a one-on-one, for example, you can ask 3 or 4 questions, and there's a way that you ask it. There's these soft skills, the tone of your voice, how much empathy you exude, your emotional expression. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you, does your emotional expression match the situation? So if someone in your team shares really terrible news, how do you handle that? How do you express empathy? How do you express a sense that they are being cared for? All of that is what we call manager facilitative interpersonal skills. And we see that as the secret sauce to teams. So the managers that can model those types of behaviors are the managers that produce high levels of psychological safety. And when teams feel that sense of psychological safety, where they can speak up, express concerns, share what's on their mind, outcomes are going to be better.
Right. And would you say this has been sort of drilled down into science, or is it still an art? Is it only those facilitators who can do this, right? Or are the, managers on the ground, can they be taught very easily and quickly on, how to do one-on-ones, which will lead to psychological safety in their teams?
Great question. And the answer is yes. What we have found is that we use a lot of video for our training. So we demonstrate, or we provide stimulus videos for individuals they're all actors depicting challenging situations within a team. And then the participant in the training needs to record a response to those stimuli. So think of it kind of like a flight simulator for managers. And when they record a response, they are practicing one of those skills that we're teaching them. And so then they get to watch themselves and they can see how they're performing, and we can give them very specific critique on how to improve, and okay, that was okay, and here's how you could do it better. And so we have skilled facilitators who really understand the skills and can teach them, and really, more importantly, look for them in those videos. That's how people get better. It's not just the concept. They need to know the concept, sure, but they really need to practice. And that's where the concept of deliberate practice comes in. That's something we're really leaning on, because we're recognizing that, for example, to become better at playing the piano or say some sort of athletic sport, it's not enough to just watch a YouTube video on how to play the piano, right? You have to spend time on the keyboard. And yet when it comes to leadership and management skills, often we're diverting people to YouTube saying, okay, watch this video, or maybe go to a workshop and sit in a classroom for 4 hours or 8 hours and absorb information. That's not enough. Because imagine if I said, hey, do you want to be a great piano player? Go watch someone play the piano on YouTube, or go to a concert of a really great piano player. It's not going to translate into you developing skills. So absolutely, people can learn the skills, and they have to do it through deliberate practice where they can see themselves, they get feedback, they try something different, they get more feedback, they try again. It's that repetitive process that leads to new behaviors and new skills being developed.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, they have to practice in a safe space as well, which is where, these facilitators will probably be the right people to sort of, do this. Are you seeing more and more companies and managers willing to go down this path? Are they acknowledging that, yes, this is something which we really need to, get our hands dirty with, and not just, watch some video and try to wing it? Are you seeing that?
Absolutely. There's certainly some hesitation, right? Because what we find with this process is that it's a little confronting, because when you record yourself, right, it's a little bit like, I don't know if you have the experience of recording your voicemail, right? Hi, you just reached, leave a voicemail. It always sounds so awkward when you listen to yourself again, right? Oh gosh, I'm going to record it again. Oh, I'm going to record it again, right? How many people have sat there for a half an hour recording a 30-second voicemail, right? So it can feel really intimidating and concerning. And I think the people, once they get through the first hurdle of discomfort and they love it, then they think, gosh, how would I learn these skills without it? Now, we have to get them there in the first place, right? We need to get them to actually try it before they can agree. And I think there's some, of course, there's resistance. And yet I think people are starting to recognize more and more that in order to improve skills, they need to practice. They can't just, they don't want to just do it on an informal basis. And so we're seeing a lot of positive reinforcements. What people come back to us with our training at time and time again is they say, this is so amazing because we learn a skill and then we have to practice it right away. And so that really makes connections for them very quickly. It's not just a concept that they have to remember and then come back to later when they're in their team meeting. They practice that skill right away.
Right. Yeah. So we spoke about the secret sauce of great teams. Let's look at the other end. What are the common mistakes that people make, while thinking about having, good, successful teams? They want that outcome, but what are the things that they end up doing wrong? And some of them might just be, because of not knowing that they're actually making that mistake. It's not like a deliberate, thing. What do you think are these common pitfalls or common mistakes that people make?
You're right that many of those pitfalls are unintentional, right? And we see that quite a bit within organizations. You get sometimes they're called toxic leaders or toxic managers, and they cause a lot of harm within their team. Of course, that's the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Those are the teams and the individuals that are really low in psychological safety. And what we find there, even with many of those leaders, they don't intend to. They don't recognize that they're causing harm. It's just these are the skills they've learned and they've developed over years, whatever environments they had been in. And a really good example is doctors. Doctors are trained to know, to have the knowledge, to be experts, to be convincing in their work environment. And so they can lean towards being kind of disciplinary, micromanaging, not necessarily fostering psychological safety. And again, it's not mean-spirited. They're not trying to be hurtful. So coming back to your question, though, what are the common pitfalls? I would say that when it comes to psychological safety and learning psychological safety and starting to appreciate it and try to bring it into their team, one of the most common pitfalls, I'd say there's two. The first one is that individuals will confound the concept of acknowledging someone and agreeing with them. So what we often teach individuals is if someone says something, you want to acknowledge it. You want to say, what I'm hearing from you is that you're really frustrated because you're getting all these requests from the other department and you can't seem to handle them on time. And it's causing you to be stressed and anxious. Did I get that right? So see how I'm acknowledging the other person, but I'm not necessarily agreeing with them. And often when we're speaking with managers and they think, okay, well, I've got to get everyone's opinions, they're concerned that an opinion is going to be expressed that they don't agree with, and now they're going to have to agree with it. We're not saying you have to agree, right? We don't all have to agree on everything all the time. However, it's really important that you demonstrate as a leader that you can listen to your team members and you demonstrate that you understand what they're saying. So it's not enough to just say, I understand. You have to say, I understand that what you're looking for is blah, or I understand that you're frustrated because of fill in the blank. And being able to reflect back in that manner demonstrates that you truly understand. And you don't have to agree with them. It's okay to say, I understand what you're saying. And you know what? I don't agree because here's why. So it facilitates conversation and dialogue. And you want to make sure that as a leader, you're having those individuals express their concerns again and again, today, tomorrow, next week. And if you just shut them down, they're not going to do that in the future. So that's the first pitfall. The second pitfall that we see is that within a team, sometimes as the leader, as a manager, two people might be sparring, if you will. You know, there's disagreement over here with these two individuals within the team. And often what we as managers want to do is take that conversation offline. So when we see a bit of a dispute, we want to talk to person A and person B and take it outside of the team scenario. But the team's being affected by those two individuals. And the team needs to know what the resolution is. And the team needs to know how that issue is going to be addressed in the moment, in the future. And so there's a hesitation among managers to want to address it within the team because they feel like they're potentially throwing someone under the bus. They're potentially harming someone within a public setting. And there's a very skillful way to be able to address those kinds of concerns in a way that keeps everyone whole. So you're not criticizing anyone, you're not demeaning anybody, and you're addressing the issue in the moment so that everybody can see that as a leader, you have the courage to address those issues and you have the skills to address them in a way that facilitates psychological safety. Because if it's just being taken offline, all the other team members are going to go, I wonder what's going on there. That was really awkward. And I wonder if it's getting resolved. So there's going to be all these question marks in people's heads that are going to cause them to be hesitant in the future.
Right. Yeah. So I think the lack of transparency sometimes hurts a lot more because you're not sure. And then that opens up the Pandora's box because then it is open for interpretation.
Absolutely. You're totally right. That Pandora's box just opens right up and people are going to make all sorts of assumptions and they're not going to know how it's being dealt with. And as a manager and a leader, you have to deal with it in a public way and not diminish anybody that's present either.
Correct. Yeah. And in terms of building great teams, what do you think is the role of diversity of thought? And we've had this discussion in previous episodes of Smartcast, where people have said that yes, I don't necessarily agree with this notion of having a quota for diversity, but then the flip side of it is only what gets measured gets done. So because I have to meet a certain quota, if it comes to maybe women in leadership teams or whatever, that's when women do get promoted to leadership. So that's this was from a woman leader who said that this was my thought earlier, but then, a boss of mine actually told me that this is how he thinks, and she sort of agreed with that. So what's your take on, building the whole diversity of thought and this sort of diversity by numbers?
Uh, it's definitely a hot topic these days, right? We've seen that a lot with the pandemic. People are speaking up and expressing concerns about diversity and wanting to feel included. And the way I look at it is through the lens of psychological safety. Psychological safety can be measured. That's the first thing, which is really nice about it as a concept. It can be measured, and it's measured relatively easily. 7 questions. And those 7 questions are robustly validated over years of research, right? So we know those 7 questions are measuring this concept of psychological safety. And one of those questions is all about, are your differences appreciated within this team? And so I think it's absolutely critical. I see diversity and psychological safety as hand in glove. They fit together so nicely, because in order to have a team that experiences psychological safety, everyone needs to be recognized for being different and how they're different, and those differences are appreciated. And so I also see the benefit with respect to decision making. Remember, I mentioned psychological safety. What does it facilitate? It facilitates decision making. And if everybody is kind of the same, right, of the same opinion, has the same worldview, suddenly your decision making is perhaps less effective, right? Because you have less data. You're just going to have a bunch of people seeing things through the same lens, and that's going to produce less good outcomes. So I think diversity is not only important, it's critical for maintaining psychological safety and having that, as you mentioned, diversity of thought, right? Diversity of opinions. And the critical factor there is that for the leader and the manager to be able to have those different points of view be expressed, especially the one dissenter, right? So if there are 6 or 7 people that all think one way and they're all in agreement, you want to make sure that 8th person in the room has the ability to speak up and say, you know what, guys, I don't agree. I simply don't agree with all 7 of you. And here's why. That is so valuable.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when we talk about principles of psychological safety, how can an individual apply some of these principles in various kinds of settings, right? I mean, I know you also coach teams, playing hockey. So do you sort of apply these principles in those teams as well, at home, family, maybe group of friends? How can an individual sort of apply these principles in different settings?
Great question. So for me, I'm trying to apply the interpersonal skills that I learn and teach and train all the time, whether it's with my family, whether it's coaching youth in sports or etc. So I'm constantly using those skills. And I'm also thinking about those skills with respect to psychological safety. That's the whole point. The whole point of using those skills is to foster psychological safety in teams. And I'd say there's one practical, a much more maybe practical consideration for any individual. And that is, I'd offer that in order to foster psychological safety or leverage it, perhaps it's leveraging psychological safety, I'd invite everybody to go to their team members or colleagues or people around them and pull them aside and, hey, can I just talk to you for 10 or 15 minutes? I'm working on improving as a leader or manager, as a whatever your role is. And what's one thing I could do better? And demonstrate that you're open to their input. And also by saying, I'm working on improving X, you're demonstrating some vulnerability there, right? You're saying, I know I'm not perfect, right? I know I have flaws and I want to get better. And then you seek their input. And then what's really critical thereafter is to have the discipline to start to put it into practice. And so you're not just shaping and changing your behaviors and learning new skills, you're also simultaneously changing how people perceive you. because if you demonstrate that vulnerability, if you ask for their input and you do something about it and they can see that, that's going to build a lot of followership, right? People are going to start to really look up to you and go, wow, I want to work with that person because they're humble enough to ask for my input and then they used it. So that's, I think if there's one practice that you can try to put into your professional work, it would be that. It would be to reach out to the people around you and ask for their input on how you can get better. Ideally, you don't just leave it wide open, like, I want to get better, but say, I want to be better at communicating one-on-one, or I want to get better at giving feedback, or I want to get better at something, fill in the blank, right? You
Right.
determine what you're trying to work on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That brings me to an interesting next question, right? With the whole, GPT-3 and DALI and all these things, machines doing so much of our work now. It's becoming even more important to do what humans do well, to be better at that, right? So how do you see probably the next decade shaping up in terms of, work, business, and how do you see, the role of psychological safety among teams? And maybe we may have to redefine teams as well. Teams might be a combination of humans and algorithms, for all you know. How do you see this shaping up in the next decade?
Well, we're definitely seeing a lot more technology infiltrating everything. And that is definitely true. And the thing we've always tried to hang our hat on is, what does software or technology do well, and what do humans do well? And I think there's always going to be room, or there's definitely going to be room in the next 10, 20 years for us as humans to become more skillful. We need to get more skillful at being able to manage other humans, talk to other humans, get their input. Because again, that technology is going to accelerate, and the issues that we're dealing with are going to become more global. And so the need for humans to be innovative is going up. And the amount of stress and anxiety that is being produced is going up, because we as humans, if things change, there's naturally going to be stress and anxiety there. And so that technology curve is going to go up. There's no question there, right? It's going to continue to accelerate, and that's going to cause us to be anxious. That's going to cause us to need to be innovative. And so psychological safety is the tool for supporting humans in feeling, overcoming that anxiety, so that we can face the fears and innovate anyway. And so it's going to be absolutely necessary for leaders and managers to master those skills within those team environments. I think that's absolutely critical. The other shift that we're seeing is that right now, the younger generation is coming up and entering the workforce, and they're looking for more values-driven work, right? They don't want to just show up to work and punch the clock, and even if they can get paid a lot of money, that's not necessarily what's driving them and motivating them. They're wanting and needing meaningful and impactful work. And back to Google's Project Aristotle, the 5 factors that they identified, the first one, of course, was psychological safety that characterized high performance teams. And I think number 4 and 5 were that the individuals within the team have meaningful work and they feel like their work is impactful. So that is going to be really critical, that we as managers and leaders within organizations, that we're showing and demonstrating to the up and coming generation that their work is meaningful and impactful. And that's a communication skill.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And in your work, how have you been using technology in maybe, measuring psychological safety? What are the tools that you've used in your work where you've leveraged technology?
Well, a couple of ways. The first, as you said, is we measure psychological safety. So that's relatively straightforward technology, right? Survey technology to be able to administer assessments. And that's one way to measure psychological safety. And we know that there's good evidence that works. And in the future, I think there's going to be other ways of measuring psychological safety that doesn't require someone to answer a question, right? We might be able to just, for example, record a meeting and be able to measure the different interpersonal interactions that are going on to be able to assess the psychological safety of those teams just by purely recording meetings that are happening on an everyday basis. So that's reams and reams and reams of data. And the second way that we use technology that I mentioned is this flight simulator technology. So our sister company, Skillsetter, their whole purpose is to develop this flight simulator environment for people to practice interpersonal skills. So we're leveraging technology there to be able to record people and have them see themselves and evaluate themselves, et cetera. The third way is through artificial intelligence. We're exploring and looking at how we can use artificial intelligence to provide people with more feedback on how they're doing with respect to their interpersonal skills. So the future being one where you can get real-time feedback, perhaps in a meeting. So when you're speaking, you might get little cues that say, "Hey, wait a minute, you're not asking enough questions," or the software might recognize that other people are starting to tune out in the meetings. How do you then respond in a productive way right there in the moment? So that is potentially where the future is. And right now we're working on AI projects, we're not getting that close yet for that real-time feedback, but instead having feedback that would occur within minutes or after a recording is made. And so that's what we're working on. And what the AI is doing is it's picking up on verbal cues, it's picking up on nonverbal cues to help understand how that leader or manager is using the interpersonal skills that we're teaching them.
Right. Yeah. And this is more of a personal question. Your work, how has that sort of shaped the way you look at life in general and all your other interests, from sports to family to friends? Has your exposure to this field played a role in changing the way you look at other things?
Yes, I would say it has, of course. So I look at the world and I see lots of problems. There's still a lot of famine. There's parts of the world that don't have fresh water. We have climate issues, et cetera, et cetera. And that weighs on me. I'm concerned about that. And I think it probably weighs on a lot of people out there. And when we put people through our training program, one of the first things we do is we ask them, how do you want to be perceived as a leader? And when I talk to people within industry, often I hear such jaded perspectives about, oh, people are, there's so many toxic leaders out there and managers don't know how to listen and da da da. And when we put people through our training, we ask them, how do you want to be perceived as a leader? And time again, we see things like, I want to be perceived as someone who's empathetic, someone who's caring, someone that people can come to because I'm a good listener, or I want to be seen as someone who can make good, solid decisions, weighing in all the data that's surrounding me, etc. So I see such positive comments. People have such wonderful aspirations in terms of how they want to be perceived as managers and leaders. And that gives me a lot of hope. I think if we could just level up every single manager and leader within the world, even just by a small percentage, I think that will breed a whole lot more solutions and outcomes for the world. Because remember, psychological safety is not just about feeling good, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's about producing results and having people feel like when they show up at work, they can be fully engaged. I can be myself. My differences are appreciated, and I can lean into this work and really do my best. And that really inspires me and excites me about the work that we're doing. And it's changed my worldview to one being much more filled with hope.
Yeah. That's great. One final question before we move to the last section. So, any books, people to follow, podcasts that you would recommend, who have inspired you in your journey, and that you would recommend to the audience to start following, reading, listening, watching?
The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson. It's the foundational book of psychological safety. So everyone needs to read that one just to get introduced to the concept. Amy Edmondson, if you're not familiar, is a Harvard professor. And so she's really the thought leader, I would say, the number one thought leader around the concept of psychological safety globally. There's another book that is really foundational to our work, which is called Peak by Anders Ericsson. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes.
Yeah. So he talks all about, he's explored 30 or 40 years, how individuals get really masterful at various psychological based skills. So not really looking at, say, sports, but looking at other arenas, sports being much more of a physical endeavor, right? So it's more of a psychological one. And he has, from his observations, come up with these principles of deliberate practice, which I think are just fantastic. And then as far as, so you asked about what books, podcasts.
People to follow on social media, Twitter.
Yeah. So then the other podcast is Adam Grant's podcast. And in particular, one of the most inspiring interviews that he's done is with Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. Oh, what a gem. He is such a gem. I can't speak highly enough about it. So if you haven't listened to Adam Grant's podcast yet, especially that one with Satya Nadella, do it now. He's just a wonderful human being. I'm so excited that an individual of that caliber is leading one of the biggest tech companies in the world, Microsoft. So, I'd say those are my top picks. Another book that I really enjoyed was The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. Yeah.
Somewhere out there.
It's somewhere on your shelf. Yes. Fantastic. It's a really good read. And then, I'm a Canadian kid. So in Canada, we have a lot of ice hockey, and I've read a number of biographies of various players, great leaders. The most recent one is the book written by Mark Messier. He's one of the greatest hockey players ever. And it's called, I think it's called You Never Win Alone. So he was a really fantastic leader, always recognizing how important it is for the team to feel part of a team. And so he really created an environment where the team comes first, and he has the results to show for it, many championships and awards, etc. So so those are a few of my recommendations.
Yeah, I think great picks, all of them. We will include all of them in the show notes with links. So let's move to the last section, which is where we ask you for your hot takes on some things that I will ask you about. Right? It could be an idea, it could be a thing, it could be a topic, or whatever. So, what do you think is the future relevance of coaching and life coaches?
Well, life coaching is becoming a lot more popular, and I think people are recognizing that it's okay to have someone in their life support them and help them in achieving their goals, and to not be doing it on their own. So I see a significant trend there, especially globally. We're very familiar with the coaching industry. We've been in the coaching industry for almost 20 years, and initially, I think it was much more focused in the United States and in Canada, but now we're seeing proliferation of coaching all over the world, in India and the Middle East and Europe, all over the place. So I think it's here to stay.
Okay. What do you think is the future relevance of remote working and work from home?
Well, we've certainly had a lot of experience with the remote working, and there's tons of benefits. So I think it's not going anywhere. And so I think as leaders and managers, we need to be able to work remotely and ideally bring people together as well. I think it's going to be a hybrid solution in most situations. Of course, some companies are going to say, no, let's all work together in the office. And then others are going to say, let's work 100% remotely. and then there's going to be everything in between. So I just think it's a lot more fluid now. The future is that it's going to be a lot more fluid, open to discussion. Let's do it this way. Let's try that way, right? There's going to be a lot more experimentation, I think, going on to help organizations figure out what's the best solution for us, for our people, because different people have different needs. And so let's try to accommodate all of them.
Yeah. Okay. And the final one, what do you think is the future relevance of organized amateur sports?
Organized amateur sports. Oh, wow. Well, I just think that what I'm seeing, and I don't know if this is everywhere, what I'm seeing is that kids don't play outside nearly as much as they used to. And so I think organized sports is growing in that kids need to play. They need to get together. They need to play. It's part of a healthy child's upbringing. And so I think organized sports is likely to become more and more popular so that we can get kids to be moving their bodies and playing with one another. And I also see that it's rising in prominence because of technology, right? Kids are on their devices at younger and younger and younger and younger ages. And parents are just trying to get any means to have their children not be on a device for a few hours. So organized sports seems like a really good way to do it. It's like, okay, little fella, or, your daughter or your son, whoever it is, you got a commitment at 4:00 on Monday and let's go, get in the car, let's go. And so people are going to play these organized sports.
Yeah. Okay. On that note, I think this is a great chat, Stephan. I think covered a whole range of topics. There are a lot of things that we're going to take away from here. We will also be posting all the show notes from this conversation, including the transcript. So people can actually take ready-made takeaways as well from this conversation. Really helpful. I think this is a great conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Harish. It was a pleasure, and you came up with some really great questions. I had a lot of fun. It was a joy. Thank you.
If you like this, we know you care about your and your team's future relevance. You can find us and click on the subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, Google and Apple Podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. There are 2 ways to enter the insider group of friends of CTQ. A Telegram channel where you'll get daily tidbits that help you think about future relevance, and our weekly email newsletter called The Upleveler. We've got some fabulous testimonials from our subscribers. We share special discount codes for CTQ compounds and exclusive invitations to our events on both these channels. Just go to choosetothink.com, that is think with a Q, and you'll find all the links to subscribe. You owe it to yourself.